The day Susanna Hawthorne turned 23, she wore a dress that had belonged to 3 other women before her, and she told herself she did not mind. But the truth lived in the careful way she held her shoulders, as though she could somehow make herself smaller than the borrowed fabric that swallowed her whole. The dress had started its life as a Sunday gown belonging to Mrs. Clara Pettigrew, the preacher's wife over in Abilene, Kansas. When Clara had grown too stout for it somewhere around 1878, she had passed it along to her sister in Dodge City, who had taken in the seams and worn it to 2 weddings and a funeral. After that sister moved east and left half her wardrobe behind, the dress had found its way to Maybelle Dodd, who ran the boarding house on Front Street where Susanna had lived for the past 14 months. Maybelle, being a generous woman with more clothes than occasions, had pressed it into Susanna's hands the previous winter with a warmth that was genuine and a pity that was even more genuine still. That was how it always went for Susanna Hawthorne. She had arrived in Dodge City, Kansas, in the autumn of 1879, with nothing but a carpetbag containing a comb, a small Bible with her mother's name written inside the cover, a change of undergarments, and a letter of recommendation from Reverend Hollies of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where she had spent the last 4 years working as a housekeeper for a family named Alcott. The Alcotts had been kind enough in their way, but kind enough in the way that people are kind to furniture. They noticed her presence when something needed doing and forgot her entirely when it did not. Before the Alcotts, there had been the Murphys. Before the Murphys, there had been the orphanage outside of Philadelphia, where Susanna had spent the first 11 years of her life learning to fold sheets with perfect corners, and to say thank you even when there was nothing to be thankful for. She had grown up belonging to no one and to everyone at once, which was perhaps the loneliest kind of belonging there was. She was not a woman who spent time feeling sorry for herself. That was something the orphanage had taught her. Well, self-pity was a luxury, the same as sugar in coffee or leather-soled shoes, and Susanna had learned young that luxuries had a way of turning into debts. So she kept her chin up and her opinions to herself, and she worked hard enough that people noticed the work without quite noticing the woman doing it, which was, she had come to understand, exactly the invisible life she had been assigned. Dodge City in 1879 was not the kind of place a young woman came to find peace. It was loud and dangerous and smelled of cattle and gunpowder and ambition, all mixed together with the dust that coated everything like a second skin. The cattle drives had made the town rich and restless in equal measure, and on any given evening the sound of fiddle music from the Long Branch Saloon competed with the distant bellow of longhorns being penned for shipping, and the whole thing hummed with an energy that was exhausting and alive at once. Susanna had come to Dodge because the letter from Reverend Hollies had secured her a position at the Dodge City Hotel as a chambermaid, which paid slightly better than her position with the Alcotts and required her to move halfway across the country, which she had considered a reasonable trade for the chance at something different. Different had not entirely materialized. She still made beds and carried linens and moved through the world without being seen, but Dodge was at least interesting in its chaos, which was something Philadelphia had never been. She had been working at the hotel for 8 months before she first noticed George Chandler. This was partly because George Chandler was not the kind of man who demanded to be noticed. He was not the loudest voice in any room, nor the most decorated, nor the one most likely to fire his pistol into the ceiling to make a point, which in Dodge City in 1879 distinguished him from approximately half the male population. He was tall, not dramatically so, but tall enough that he had to duck through certain doorways, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples when the weather was humid, and brown eyes that had the quality of listening even when he was not speaking. He was 28 years old and had come to Kansas from Texas 3 years prior, when the cattle business had pulled men north like a tide pulling at the shore. He ran the Chandler operation, which was what people called it when they spoke of it, as though the name alone explained everything, and in Dodge it mostly did. The Chandler operation meant approximately 1,500 head of cattle moved up the Kishom Trail each year, a remuda of 40 horses, a crew of 12 men who were loyal because George paid fairly and treated them with the kind of steady decency that is rarer than people admit, and a modest but growing reputation as a man whose word was worth the same whether or not anyone was watching him keep it. He stayed at the Dodge City Hotel when he was in town, which was roughly twice a year during the shipping season, and he was the kind of guest who left his room tidier than he found it and always left a coin on the dresser for the chambermaid, which was not common practice, and which Susanna had noticed before she had ever properly seen his face. The first time she actually spoke to him was a Tuesday morning in June of 1880, when she had come to turn down the hallway rooms and found him standing outside his door in his shirt sleeves, squinting at something he had written on a piece of paper with the concentrated look of a man trying to add up numbers that were not cooperating. "Pardon me," she said, because she needed to get past him with the linens. He looked up immediately, folded the paper, and stepped aside. "My apologies, miss, I was blocking the way." She noticed that he actually looked at her when he said it. Not through her, not past her, but at her, the way a person looks at another person when they register that a person is there. It was a small thing. It was an enormous thing. "You are Mr. Chandler," she said, because she had seen his name in the register. "George," he said, "and you are Susanna Hawthorne. Miss Hawthorne." He said her name the way people say a name when they intend to remember it. "You are the one who ironed the curtains." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. The curtains in room 7, he said. "Someone ironed them. They have been crooked on that rod since the spring, but someone ironed them and straightened the rod. I noticed." She had done that. It had taken her 20 extra minutes on a Friday afternoon, and she had done it because the crooked curtains had been bothering her for weeks, not because anyone asked or would notice. She had assumed no one would. "I did," she said. He smiled. It was a quiet smile, not performative in the way that frontier men often were. "Well, they look a great deal better." She did not know what to do with a compliment that specific and that sincere, so she said, "Thank you, sir," and moved on down the hallway with her linens, and did not let herself think about it for the rest of the morning, which required more concentration than ironing curtains had. The summer of 1880 moved through Dodge City the way Kansas summers do, with a heat that is almost philosophical in its commitment, relentless and dry and bright enough to bleach the color out of things. Susanna worked her days at the hotel and spent her evenings in the small room at the back of Maybelle Dodd's boarding house, reading when she could get hold of a book and mending borrowed clothes that were not quite her size. She had 3 dresses to her name, none of them original to her. The Clara Pettigrew dress, which was dark blue and respectable. A calico print that had come from a woman named Dolers who had married a merchant and outgrown her plainer wardrobe. And a gray working dress that she had bought second-hand from a stall on Front Street for 40 cents, which was technically the first piece of clothing she had ever paid for with her own money, though even that had come from a barrel of cast-offs and had belonged to someone else first. She did not often let herself dwell on this. But sometimes, in the evening light, she would sit on the edge of her narrow bed and look at the 3 dresses hanging on their hooks and feel a quiet grief for the girl she had been, and the woman she was, and the someone she might have been under different circumstances. A woman with things that were chosen and new and entirely her own. It was Maybelle who told her about the position at the Chandler Ranch. George Chandler came in asking after a cook and a housekeeper, Maybelle said one August morning, pouring coffee with the authority of a woman who considers information and coffee equally sustaining. "His regular housekeeper married a farmer and moved to Nebraska. He needs someone reliable." "He has a ranch nearby?" Susanna asked. "About 12 miles east. Fine piece of land, from what I hear. Running water, real floors, proper kitchen. He does not come to town much except for the drives." Maybelle set down her pot and looked at Susanna with the frank appraisal of someone who knows more than they are saying. "I told him about you." Susanna set down her cup. "Maybelle, You are reliable and you are wasted making beds at the hotel. The pay is better. You would have your own room, a real room with a window that faces east. Mabel said it as though a window facing east was the resolution to everything, and looking at Susanna's face across the breakfast table, she clearly believed it was part of it. He will be at the hotel tomorrow morning. I said you would speak with him. She thought about refusing. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds, which was how long it took her to weigh the borrowed dress, the narrow room, the gray 40-cent second-hand dress against the possibility of something that was even marginally different. "All right," she said. George Chandler arrived at the hotel dining room at 7 in the morning, which told her immediately that he was a man who took things seriously, because meetings at 7 in the morning were not social occasions. He had already ordered coffee and was reading something, a newspaper from Kansas City that was 3 days old, which was the freshest news Dodge usually got, and he rose when she came in, which was the kind of manners that were not universal in 1880 and which she noted. They discussed the position with the directness of two people who did not have time for indirection. The pay was $12 a month, which was better than the hotel by $4. She would have her own room. Her duties would be cooking, household management, laundry, and keeping the bunkhouse linens in order for the crew. She would have Sunday afternoons free. "I have references," she said, and produced Reverend Hollis's letter and a second letter from the hotel manager, who had written it with the efficient warmth of a man acknowledging competence without quite managing enthusiasm. George read both letters carefully, which she appreciated because most men glanced at such things. He folded them and returned them to her. "Mrs. Dodd speaks well of you," he said, "and I remember the curtains." "I remember the coin on the dresser," she said, and then was not entirely sure why she said it. He looked at her steadily. "I hope that was not impertinent." "It was considerate," she said. Most guests do not consider that someone has to carry all those sheets up and down the stairs," he said simply, and she realized he meant it as a matter of fact rather than performance, and that was somehow more striking than if he had made a production of it. She accepted the position. She told the hotel manager on Thursday and arrived at the Chandler Ranch on a Saturday morning in August 1880, with her carpetbag and her 3 borrowed dresses, and the small Bible with her mother's name in it. And when she stepped out of the wagon that had brought her from town and looked at the house, a solid, 2-story structure built from real timber with a proper porch and a kitchen garden that had gotten somewhat wild in the recent absence of management, she felt something shift in her chest that she was not immediately able to name. The ranch hand who had driven her out, a lean man named Eli with a perpetual squint from years of riding into the western sun, carried her bag to the front door without being asked, and then tipped his hat and departed, leaving her standing on the porch with the August heat pressing down and the sound of cattle somewhere in the middle distance, and the smell of dry grass and wood and something cooking, which she shortly realized was a pot of coffee that George had put on before riding out to check the south pasture fence. There was a note on the kitchen table. It was written in a clear, even hand. "Coffee on the stove. I will be back by noon. The pantry needs taking stock of. Make yourself at home. G. Chandler. Make yourself at home." She read it twice and then set it down on the table and looked around the kitchen, which had good bones and bad organization and the residue of a month of bachelor cooking, and thought about what it meant to make yourself at home somewhere, when home was a concept you had encountered mostly in other people's versions of it. She started with the pantry. By the time George returned at noon, she had cataloged the pantry, organized the kitchen, started a loaf of bread, and identified 6 distinct things that needed repair in the main room, 2 of which she could fix herself and 4 of which required a carpenter. He came in through the back door with his hat in his hand and the look of a man who has been in the sun for 4 hours and stopped when he saw the kitchen. "You moved the flour," he said. "It was stored where it could draw moisture," she said, not apologetically. "I put it in the tin by the stove. I also found that you are nearly out of salt and entirely out of baking powder, and the pot rack is pulling away from the ceiling beam on the left side." He looked at the pot rack. He looked at her. He sat down at the kitchen table, with the manner of a man confronted with competence he had not anticipated and found unexpectedly pleasant. "I will send for salt and baking powder next time someone goes to town." "I made a list," she said, and placed it in front of him. He picked it up. He read through it with the attention he had given her references, which was to say he actually read it rather than skimming. "Coffee," he said, reading aloud. "Salt, baking powder, lamp oil, thread black and white, new broom, nutmeg." "Nutmeg is not essential," she said, "but it improves a good number of things." The corner of his mouth moved. "I will get the nutmeg," he said. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was new in every way that mattered. Susanna had spent years adjusting herself to the shape of other people's households, learning where things were kept, and what was expected, and how much of herself to fold away to fit the available space. The Chandler ranch was different in ways she kept noticing. George Chandler did not fill the air with his own presence the way the Alcott men had, that particular brand of male certainty that colonized every room it entered. He was simply there, and the house felt like it had room for other people in it. He had a crew of 12 men who ate in a separate cookhouse, and feeding them was a significant portion of Susanna's days. Biscuits and salt pork and dried beans, with the occasional fresh-killed chicken on a Sunday, and coffee enough to float the state of Kansas. The men were polite to her in the way that men are when the boss sets an example of politeness, which George did without appearing to make a show of it. And Susanna found after the first 2 weeks that she knew most of their names and something about each of them, which was the first time in her life that people she worked among had felt like something approaching a community rather than a backdrop. She still wore the borrowed dresses, the blue one for Sundays when she walked to the small church 3 miles down the road, which she did on foot with the meditative determination of someone to whom walking is a form of prayer. The calico for kitchen work because it was already stained, and she did not particularly mind adding to its history. The gray one for everything else. George noticed the dresses the way he noticed most things, quietly, without making a statement of it, but with the particular attention of a man who does not look at people casually. He did not say anything for the first month. He was not the kind of man who commented on women's clothing, which was both respectful and, in this particular case, meant he was watching longer before he spoke. What changed it was the day in September when Susanna was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, and the gray dress caught on the fence post and tore a seam from the hem up 6 inches. She mended it that evening with the black thread from the list, because it was the thread she had, and the repair was competent but visible, a dark line against the gray like a scar. She wore it to breakfast the next morning because she had no other option. George came in from the barn and poured his coffee and sat across from her at the table. They had fallen into the habit of eating breakfast together, which had started practically and stayed because they were, both of them, people who valued the company of someone who did not require noise. And he looked at the mend on the skirt, and then he looked at his coffee and he did not say anything. But his expression had the quality of a man who is turning something over in his mind and coming to conclusions that the situation should have been different. That evening, he came to the kitchen while she was finishing the dinner dishes and set a small parcel on the counter. "I was in town today for the farrier," he said. "I stopped at Whitmore's Dry Goods." She looked at the parcel. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Mr. Chandler, George," he said. It was the 3rd or 4th time he had corrected this. He said it without irritation, patiently, the way you say something you will keep saying until it takes. "George." She said it carefully, and it felt different in her mouth than "sir." "What is this?" "Thread," he said. "All the colors they had. And a better needle case. The one I saw you using is yours from home, I think, and the eye on the main needle is wearing." She untied the string. The parcel contained 6 spools of thread, black, white, gray, blue, brown, and a deep green, and a leather needle case with 4 needles of different gauges, and a small pair of embroidery scissors with handles shaped like a bird. She stood very still with the needle case in her hands, and felt something happening behind her breastbone that she did not have a word for immediately. It was not gratitude exactly, or rather it was gratitude, but underneath the gratitude was something more complex, the feeling of being seen in a way that was not about usefulness or function, but about the ordinary human need for things that work properly and are genuinely yours. "You did not have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. He leaned against the doorframe with his coffee cup and looked at her with the steady brown eyes that she had come to understand were his version of openness, his way of being present without being loud about it. "How long have you been making do?" The question was so direct and so gentle at once that she nearly did not answer it. "All my life," she said, and the honesty of it surprised her that it came out at all. He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and the remnants of dinner, and outside the first autumn darkness was settling over the Kansas prairie with the slow, enormous quality that prairie darkness has, as though the sky is making a commitment. "Well," he said finally, and his voice had something in it she could not categorize except that it made the kitchen feel warmer than the stove accounted for. "That is a long time." He pushed off the doorframe and took his coffee out onto the porch, and Susanna stood in the kitchen holding the needle case with the bird handles and thought about what a long time it was, and how the thread in 6 colors was sitting on the counter like something small and entirely hers. Autumn came to the Kansas plains with the gorgeous indifference of a season that does not concern itself with whether you are ready for it. The grass turned from green to gold to brown, and the light changed in that particular way it changes on the prairie, going from the flat white of summer to something angled and amber that made everything look considered, the way things look in paintings. The cattle drives had wound down for the season, the shipping done, and the ranch settled into its winter preparation rhythm, mending fences and chopping wood and putting up stores and all the careful, unhurried work of getting ready for the cold. George was around the house more in the autumn, which was not something Susanna had anticipated, and which required a small internal adjustment. She was used to solitude, had been for most of her life, and had organized her working days around it, the particular freedom of moving through a space and making decisions without consulting anyone. Having him present was different but not, she found, unwelcome. He was good company in the specific way of someone who understands that company does not require constant speech. They got into the habit of evenings on the porch after supper, when the work of the day was finished and the crew had gone to the bunkhouse, and the ranch settled into its night sounds. The occasional call of cattle, the creak of the house in the wind, the coyotes far out on the flat dark of the prairie. Susanna would bring her mending or a book when she could get one, and George would sit with his coffee or sometimes a small glass of whiskey and look out at the dark or read his own correspondence, and they would sit together in a silence that had the quality of contentment rather than emptiness. They talked, too, gradually and then more and more. She told him about the orphanage in a matter-of-fact way, not asking for sympathy, just describing it the way you describe a place you lived. And he listened with the attentiveness he gave to everything and did not make it awkward with excessive pity or with the particular kind of admiration that is another version of pity. He told her about Texas, about growing up on a smaller operation that had barely survived the drought years, about his father who had died when George was 22 and left him the cattle and a debt that had taken 2 years and a great deal of stubborn work to clear. "You built all of this from that?" she asked one evening, meaning the ranch, the land, the 12 men in the bunkhouse. "Mostly," he said, "and some luck and some good timing and a few years of not sleeping much." He was quiet for a moment. "My father was a good man who worked himself to exhaustion and died before he got to rest. I decided I would do the work, but I would also learn to sit on the porch sometimes." She thought about that. "Is that what this is? Resting?" He looked at her sidelong, and in the lamplight spilling through the window she could see the quiet amusement in his expression. "I think it might be," he said. The first real cold came in October, and with it came a letter from a woman named Harriet Cross in Wichita, who was apparently the aunt of George's neighbor, a man named Phillips, and who had heard through the intricate telegraph of frontier social connection that there was an unmarried man of means and good character in the vicinity of Dodge City who might be amenable to correspondence with a marriageable woman of good family. The letter was addressed to George but had arrived at the ranch, and Susanna had, as a matter of course, sorted the mail. She set it on his desk without comment and went back to the kitchen and told herself firmly that she was not thinking about it. She thought about it all afternoon. George came in at supper time and found the letter and read it and came to the kitchen doorway. "Did you see this?" "I sorted the mail," she said, without turning from the stove. "It is from a woman in Wichita." "So I understand from the return address." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not going to write back," he said. She finally turned from the stove and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with the letter in one hand and an expression that was careful and honest and slightly uncertain, which was the most uncertain she had seen him. "That is your decision to make," she said. "Yes," he said, "and I have made it." He held her gaze for a moment in the way that people look at each other when they are saying something that the words are not quite containing, and then he folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket and came to help set the table, which was not something she had asked him to do, and which he had been doing for about 3 weeks now, small and steady. She turned back to the stove. The kitchen was warm. The prairie outside was going dark and cold. She felt something in her chest that she recognized, finally, as the early and very frightening stages of caring about someone in a way that was not simply professional or friendly but personal and specific and irreversible. And she was not entirely sure whether to be glad or terrified, so she settled on being both simultaneously, which seemed honest. She had been at the ranch for 3 months when George Chandler asked her if she would go to church with him on Sunday. This was not, in itself, dramatic. They lived on the same property and had been having breakfast together for months, and he had been helping set the table for weeks. And Dodge City in 1880 had its own social codes about what meant what, and the community church 3 miles down the road was about as public a venue as existed. Going to church together meant something, and they both knew it meant something, and neither of them pretended it did not. She wore the blue dress, which was the best one, and she hated it a little because it was not hers, because it had fit 3 women before her and fit her imperfectly, too long in the hem and too wide in the shoulders, and she had taken it in and taken it up, and still it felt like a costume, like she was wearing someone else's notion of what a respectable woman looked like on a Sunday morning. George came around with the small buggy he kept for non-working purposes and handed her up into it with the steadiness of a man to whom it is natural to offer his hand, and they drove the 3 miles through the October morning with the prairie around them wide and golden, and the air sharp enough to be interesting. He did not make conversation for the sake of it, and she was glad, and the silence between them had the quality of something they had built together over months of evenings on the porch. At the church she was aware of eyes. Dodge City was not a small community in the way that eastern towns were small, but it had the social patterns of small places, people watching and noting and drawing conclusions. She saw the preacher's wife look between them with the particular assessment of a woman cataloging a situation. She saw a woman she knew vaguely from the hotel look at her dress with the small, involuntary twitch of recognition that said the dress was known, had been seen before, had a history. She kept her chin up. She had been keeping her chin up since she was 7 years old. It was practically a professional skill. After the service, George introduced her to people with the easy, natural assumption that she would want to be introduced, which sounds like a small thing but which, for a woman who had spent most of her life being the invisible help, felt considerable. He said, "This is Susanna Hawthorne, and not this is my housekeeper," and the difference mattered in ways she could not entirely articulate. It was on the drive home that he said it. They were perhaps a mile from the ranch, with the wind picking up from the northwest in the way that presages genuine cold, and he had been quiet in the thoughtful way he sometimes was, and she had been looking at the grass bending in the wind and thinking about the evening's supper, and he said, "Susanna." She looked at him. "I would like to take you into Dodge next Saturday," he said, with the straightforward manner of a man who has decided something and has confidence in the decision even if the saying of it is uncertain. "There is a dressmaker on 2nd Avenue, Mrs. Bellamy. She does good work." He paused. "I would like for you to have things that are yours." She felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. "George," she said carefully, "I am your housekeeper." "You are," he said. "And you are also a woman I have had breakfast with every morning for 3 months and evenings on the porch every night for 2, and I ironed that into a fact in my own head a good while back." He kept his eyes on the road, which she understood was the way he managed saying things that mattered, looking at the familiar and forward rather than the uncertain and sideways. "I am not asking you to be anything you are not ready to be. I am asking if you will let me take you to the dressmaker." The prairie stretched out around them, enormous and plain and beautiful, and Susanna Hawthorne sat in the buggy with her hands folded in the lap of a dress that had belonged to 3 women before her, and felt something cracking open in her chest that had been carefully sealed for a very long time. "All right," she said. "Yes." He nodded once with satisfaction, as though a thing had been properly settled. "Good," he said. They drove the last mile home in a silence that was entirely different from the silence going out. This one had something in it that was warm and new and slightly electric, the way the air feels before a thunderstorm when the atmosphere is charging itself with something enormous and inevitable. The following Saturday arrived with a cold clarity that Dodge City sometimes produces in October, the sky a hard blue, the air sharp, the light so clean and direct it made everything look like it had just been invented. George brought the buggy around at 9 in the morning, and Susanna climbed up in the blue dress that had belonged to Clara Pettigrew, and they drove the 12 miles to Dodge with the kind of conversation that comes naturally after months of other conversations, easy and ranging, and punctuated by the comfortable silences of people who no longer need to fill every gap. Mrs. Bellamy's dress shop was on 2nd Avenue, between the hardware store and the land office, with a window that held a single display, a woman's dress form wearing a half-finished gown in deep burgundy that was the most beautiful thing Susanna had seen in months, which was not saying much since she had been looking at dry goods and ranch architecture, but which was still genuinely beautiful. She stopped at the window. George stopped beside her. "Do you want to go in?" he asked. She had not been inside a dressmaker's shop since she was 11 years old and accompanying Mrs. Murphy, who had needed a new dress for her daughter's wedding and had brought Susanna along to carry the parcels. She remembered the smell of it, clean fabric and thread, and something floral that was probably sachets in the drawers, and the particular quality of the light in a room full of cloth, the way different colors caught it differently. "Yes," she said. Mrs. Bellamy was a small, brisk woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and capable hands, and the particular authority of someone very good at their work. She looked at Susanna with the professional gaze of a woman accustomed to sizing people up in the quite literal sense, and she looked at George with the slightly more social gaze of a woman assessing intention. "Good morning," George said. "Miss Hawthorne will be wanting several dresses. And anything else she needs. She will tell you what she would like and I will settle the account." Mrs. Bellamy raised her eyebrows a fractional amount. George's expression was calm and certain. Susanna was looking at a bolt of fabric on the display shelf, a deep teal green, the color of the ocean in a painting she had once seen in someone else's hallway, and she was gripping the strap of her carpetbag with both hands. "Miss Hawthorne," Mrs. Bellamy said, with the measured warmth of a businesswoman who understands that the customer who will be wearing the clothes is the most important person in the transaction, "shall we have a look at what I have in?" They looked. Mrs. Bellamy had bolts of fabric stacked along both walls, a range of practical and Sunday-best materials in more colors than Susanna had seen in a domestic context in her entire life. There were calicos and broadcloths and a fine wool for winter and a silk that Susanna looked at and then looked away from immediately, because silk was for other kinds of women. "That's silk," George said, from somewhere behind her. She turned to find him looking at it, a deep blue-green stripe with a cream ground. "That is not practical," she said. "I know," he said. "You can have practical and impractical both. What did you say you liked best?" She had not said anything. She had only been looking. She stared at him. "I watch," he said simply. "You stopped at the teal bolt first." She turned back to the shelves, and for a moment she did not trust herself to speak. She had spent 23 years in rooms full of things that were not hers, making decisions about other people's property, accommodating herself to other people's choices. The idea of pointing at things and having them become hers was so foreign and so achingly right that she had to take a moment to arrange her face into something that was not entirely transparent. "Everything she points at," George said to Mrs. Bellamy, quietly, and it was not a boast or a performance, just a statement of intent. He meant it the way he meant things, practically and completely. Mrs. Bellamy had been in Dodge City for 6 years, and had measured and fitted and sewn for cattle wives and saloon women and school teachers and the wives of railroad men. And she was not a sentimental woman, but she recognized something when she saw it. And she saw it now in the way the young woman with the imperfectly fitted blue dress turned slowly to look at the man who had said what he had just said. And the way something moved across her face that was equal parts wonder and the particular grief of someone who is getting something they had given up expecting. Susanna pointed. She pointed at the teal-green broadcloth first because it was honest and she wanted it. She pointed at a warm brown wool for winter, practical and good. She pointed at a gray calico that was lighter and better made than anything she currently owned and a cream-colored muslin for summer. She hesitated for a long time in front of the silk. "The silk," George said, not a command, just a confirmation. "It is extravagant," she said. "It is," he agreed without apology. She pointed at the silk. "Mrs. Bellamy took measurements with the efficient certainty of someone who does this with the full weight of craft, and Susanna stood on the small measuring platform in the center of the shop and held still, while Mrs. Bellamy moved around her with her tape and her pins. And she was aware of George sitting in the chair by the window, not watching in a way that was intrusive, just present, reading a newspaper someone had left on the small table there. "The blue you are wearing was Clara Pettigrew's," Mrs. Bellamy said, matter-of-factly, pinning a seam on the sample fitting bodice. "I know the cut." "Yes," Susanna said. Mrs. Bellamy looked at her with the direct gaze of a practical woman. "You are built differently, narrower through the shoulders, longer through the waist. Clara was always broad." She pinned another seam with precision. "Your things will fit properly." It was such a simple statement. "Your things will fit properly." Susanna looked at the far wall with the bolts of fabric and thought about what it meant to have something that fit properly, that was made for your specific body and no one else's, and she breathed very carefully through her nose and kept her expression composed. They were at Mrs. Bellamy's for 2 hours. When they left, George had arranged to return in 3 weeks for the finished garments, and he had also, at Mrs. Bellamy's suggestion, purchased a pair of proper leather shoes that fit Susanna's actual feet, because Mrs. Bellamy also stocked shoes, and because the ones Susanna was wearing were Maybelle Dodds and too wide and she had been stuffing the toes with rags, which Mrs. Bellamy had identified with the quiet efficiency of someone who has seen everything. They walked out of the shop onto 2nd Avenue and stood in the October light, and Susanna said, "George." He turned to look at her. "I do not know how to." She stopped. She tried again. "I have never." She stopped again, because the sentences were not coming out in any form that was adequate, and the inadequacy was making her throat tighten. "Thank you," she finally managed, and she said it with all the weight of 23 years, and he received it the same way, understanding that it was not simple or lightweight but a sentence carrying considerable freight. "You do not have to thank me for having your own things," he said, gently but directly, the way he said things that he wanted to be clear about. "I know," she said, "but I want to, all the same." He looked at her for a moment with the brown eyes that listened even when he was not speaking, and then he said, "Are you hungry? There is a decent lunch at the hotel." She laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it changed her face into something that George Chandler had not seen before and found immediately that he wanted to see again, often for a considerable length of time. "Yes," she said, "I am hungry." They had lunch at the hotel, at a table by the window that looked out onto Front Street, and they talked for 2 hours about things that were not practical at all, books they had read, places they had not been but thought about, the particular philosophy of wide open spaces versus crowded ones, whether nutmeg was genuinely essential or merely pleasant, which Susanna argued was not a real distinction. George argued it was and lost the argument willingly, which is a particular skill. On the drive home, the afternoon light was going golden and long over the prairie, and somewhere in the middle distance a hawk was riding a thermal in long, patient spirals, and the whole landscape had the quality of something that was exactly itself, not pretending to be anything else. "Susanna," George said and stopped. She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it properly, not in a kitchen or on a porch, but properly." She turned to look at him. His jaw had the set of a man who has made up his mind about something and is now doing the thing his mind is made up about, which is always slightly different from the deciding. "I am not a man who is good with many words," he said. "You know that by now, but I think I have made myself clear in other ways, and I am going to make myself clear in words now as well." He kept the horse moving at its steady pace, because they both needed the motion and the forward direction. "I would like very much for you to stay, not as a housekeeper, as my wife if you will have me. I understand if it is too soon or if you need more time. I am not asking you to decide today, but I am asking." The prairie was enormous and quiet and golden all around them, and Susanna Hawthorne sat with the October wind in her face and 23 years of borrowed things behind her and a man beside her who had taken her to the dressmaker and said everything she pointed at, and she thought about what it was to be asked, to be genuinely and specifically asked, not assigned or sorted into a role but asked. "It is not too soon," she said. "I have been sure for a while. I was waiting to see if you were." He looked at her then fully with the expression of a man who was in the process of receiving the thing he had wanted and finding it exactly what he had hoped, which is not always how it goes and which he was therefore not taking for granted. "I am sure," he said. "Then yes," she said. "I will marry you, George Chandler." He stopped the horse. Right there on the road, 12 miles from town, with the hawk still circling and the grass bending in the wind and the enormous Kansas sky going amber above them. He stopped the horse and turned to her and took her hand in his, not her gloved hand but the actual hand, his thumb against her palm, and looked at her with everything he was in his face, without the careful quiet of it, just open and real, and she felt that sealed thing in her chest open all the way. He kissed her then, not dramatically but with the steadiness that was characteristic of him, and she thought that she had never been kissed by someone who meant it this specifically before, and that it was entirely different from what she had imagined, which was already something she had spent some time imagining. The horse, unbothered, cropped at the grass on the roadside and waited. They were married in December of 1880, at the small church 3 miles from the ranch, on a Saturday when the prairie was frostbright, and the sky was the particular colorless blue of a cold winter day, which sounds bleak and was actually beautiful. Susanna wore the teal-green broadcloth dress that Mrs. Bellamy had made, which fit her the way clothes fit people when they are made for that specific body and no other, precisely and entirely. It was the first new dress she had ever owned that had never belonged to anyone else. She had looked at herself in the mirror that morning, in Maybelle Dodd's spare room where she had spent her last night as an unmarried woman because Maybelle had insisted, and she had looked at the dress and at herself in it. And she had been, for the first time that she could remember, the woman in the glass without reservation. Not a woman wearing someone else's silhouette, not a woman inhabiting a shape that had been someone else's first. Just Susanna, in a dress that was hers, about to go marry a man who had seen her clearly and chosen her specifically. She cried a little, just briefly. Then she straightened the bodice and went downstairs to where Maybelle was waiting with coffee and the no-nonsense tenderness of a woman who has seen enough of life to know when something is genuinely good. George was at the altar with his foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Thomas Reed, who had been with him since Texas, and who wore his good clothes with the faint discomfort of a man more at home in working gear. George turned when she came in, and the expression on his face was not complicated or theatrical, just the face of a man who is looking at the exact right thing. Reverend James performed the ceremony with the practical warmth of a frontier preacher who understood that the people in front of him had lives of substance and did not need embellishment. The vows were the traditional ones, said by both of them with the seriousness they deserved, and when the Reverend declared them married and George kissed her at the altar, there was a sound from the small gathering, Thomas and a few of the ranch hands and Maybelle and some neighbors. That was the unrehearsed sound of people being genuinely pleased about a thing. The celebration afterward was modest and warm, held at the ranch in the main room that Susanna had organized in September, and which now had the particular quality of a space that has been looked after with care, with the good lamp oil in the lamps and the curtains straight on their rods, and the table set with everything in its proper place. Thomas Reed played fiddle, which was a side of the foreman that impressed her, and Eli the ranch hand danced with Maybelle with great energy and minimal skill, and George danced with Susanna twice, which in a gathering of 12 people was a statement about priorities. The house, that night after everyone had gone and the lamps were burning low in the December cold, felt like hers, not borrowed or assigned or incidentally occupied, but hers, in the legal and emotional and physical way that things feel yours when you belong to them and they to you. She stood in the kitchen in the teal-green dress and looked at the pantry she had organized and the pot rack she had fixed and the 6 spools of thread on the shelf in the colors she had been given, and she felt the particular quality of an ending that is also a beginning, not a door closing but a threshold crossed. George came in from checking the livestock, as he did every night regardless of weather, and found her standing in the kitchen looking at the pantry with an expression he could not quite read. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Everything is very all right," she said, and turned to him. "I was just thinking that this is the first home I have ever had." He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was warm, the way it always was in the evenings when the stove had been going all day, and the light from the lamp made everything amber and close. "It is yours," he said. "Entirely." She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, which was new and not yet familiar and exactly what it should be, and he held her with the steadiness that she had come to know was not complacency but genuine solidity, the kind that comes from a person who has been tested and has held. The winter of 1881 was a hard one in Kansas, which winters in Kansas reliably are, as though the prairie considers the season a character-building exercise and applies it without mercy. The creeks froze solid, and the temperature dropped to places that made the mornings dangerous, and the work of keeping the ranch going in winter weather was substantial water troughs to be broken and refilled, cattle to be monitored for sickness, firewood to be split and carried in quantities that seemed impossible until they turned out to be necessary. Susanna had not grown up with physical labor that was particular to open space. The orphanage and the Alcotts and the hotel had been indoor work, and the first winter showed her things about herself that she had not known, primarily that she was considerably stronger than she had understood, and that she did not mind hard work when it was work for something genuinely hers. She learned to mend fences under George's patient instruction, which she was not quite good at by spring, but was improved enough to be useful. She learned which of the cattle were reliable and which were trouble. She learned that Thomas Reed, who had seemed intimidating in his broad-shouldered foremanness, was actually deeply kind and very funny in a dry way that took about 3 weeks to understand. She also, over that winter, learned George Chandler in the particular and irreversible way of people who share a life rather than simply sharing proximity. She learned that he woke at 4 in the morning without an alarm, that he was not grumpy in the morning the way some men are, but simply quiet until the coffee took hold. She learned that he was genuinely angry only 2 or 3 times all winter, and both times it was over something happening to one of the animals or one of the men, not something happening to him. She learned that he read more than she had expected, not novels particularly, but history and natural science and the occasional philosophical treatise, which he would read slowly and then set aside with the look of a man storing something for later consideration. He learned her, too, in the way that was also irreversible. He learned that she had nightmares sometimes, not often but sometimes, and that the best thing was to simply hold her until the dream feeling passed rather than to ask about it, which she had told him once and which he had not needed telling twice. He learned that she had strong opinions that she had spent most of her life keeping to herself, and that she was right about most of them, and that the house was better in all the ways that her opinions had been applied to it. He learned that she loved the prairie in a way that he had feared. She might not. Some Eastern-born people found the flatness suffocating, but she found it freeing in the way that only people who have spent their lives in tight spaces understand that vastness is a gift. Spring came to the Kansas plains in March of 1881 with the tentative, then insistent warmth that feels like a promise being kept, and with it came the cattle drive season and all the preparation that entailed. And with that came a piece of news that Susanna told George on a clear March morning on the porch with her coffee in her hands, and the first crocus pushing up through the mud at the edge of the kitchen garden. She was expecting a child. George was silent for a moment that she measured as approximately 4 seconds, which for him was practically breathless, and then he set down his coffee and reached across and covered both her hands with his, and looked at her with the open, unguarded expression that she had first seen on the road in October, and which she now understood was his version of everything, the full, unreserved version of George Chandler with nothing held back. "Are you well?" He asked first, which was what she had known he would ask first. "I am well," she said. "I am very well." He squeezed her hands. "Good," he said. "That is the first thing. What is the second thing?" She asked, although she could see the second thing on his face. "The second thing is that I am going to need a moment," he said, and the corner of his mouth was doing the thing it did when he was trying not to be too obvious about being happy, which he was generally better at than this. She laughed. Outside, the crocus was genuinely purple against the brown mud, and the morning was cold but heading toward warmth, and the prairie was waking up in that enormous, patient way it had, and she was sitting on her own porch with her husband's hands around hers, and she was, she thought, precisely the most fortunate she had ever been. The pregnancy went smoothly, as frontier pregnancies sometimes did and sometimes catastrophically did not, and Susanna was healthy and practical about it in the way she was healthy and practical about most things. She kept working modified, more carefully, with George hovering at a respectful but alert distance that she found both occasionally exasperating and genuinely touching. And she let Mrs. Bellamy let out the seams on 2 of her dresses as needed, which Mrs. Bellamy did with the brisk competence of someone who has done this many times. The cattle drive went north in April as it did every year, George leading it with Thomas, and Susanna managed the ranch in their absence with Eli and 2 of the younger hands, which she did with the organizational capability that had been running households since she was 12 years old, applied now to something that was genuinely hers, and therefore something she managed not from duty, but from the particular investment of a person caring for their own. George came back from the drive in June, trail dusty and lean and taller seeming than she remembered from 5 weeks' absence. And the way he looked at her when he climbed off his horse in the yard, taking in both her and the increased evidence of the child they were expecting, was one of the things she would keep with her always. The way certain moments arrange themselves into permanence without asking permission. The baby came in November of 1881, on a cold Tuesday morning when the frost was still on the window glass and the kitchen stove had been going since before dawn. Thomas Reed rode hard to get the doctor from town, who arrived in time to be useful, which was not guaranteed in 1881 Kansas, and for which Susanna was profoundly grateful. The labor was long but not complicated, and at 7 in the morning George was allowed back into the bedroom he had been banished from since 4, and Susanna placed in his arms a son, a boy with dark hair like his father and the alert, unimpressed expression of a person who has arrived and is forming opinions. "James," she said, she had thought about it carefully, "after Reverend James who married us." George looked at the baby with the expression of a man who is encountering something he did not know was possible to feel, the specific and total quality of it. "James," he repeated quietly, as though testing the name and finding it exactly right. He looked up at her then, and she saw in his face the same thing she had seen on the October road when she had said yes, the unreserved version, the full and open version, nothing held back. "You are remarkable," he said, simply and sincerely. "I am exhausted," she said, equally sincerely, and he laughed, and she laughed, and James opened his eyes and looked at both of them with the profound indifference of someone who has just arrived and has not yet settled on a position. James Chandler grew the way children in 1880s Kansas grew, quickly, and with the particular resilience that frontier life demanded, as though the landscape itself selected for sturdiness. By the time he was pulling himself upright on the kitchen table legs at 10 months, Susanna had already understood that he had inherited his father's stubbornness along with his father's hair, which she considered fair cosmic accounting since she had brought her own stubbornness to the arrangement. George was a father the way Susanna might have predicted from watching him be every other version of himself present, steady, patient, and specific. He did not parent with the distance that was common for men of the era, the arrangement whereby fathers were figures of authority observed from afar, and mothers were the daily substance of a child's world. He got up in the night when James cried. He carried him in the sling across his chest when he was working near the house. He talked to him, even when James was very small, in the even, informative way he talked to everyone, as though James's opinions were worth consulting. Susanna watched this and felt the old sealed thing in her chest, the thing that had been cracking open since October 1880, open the rest of the way, so completely that she could no longer quite remember what the sealed version had felt like, only that it had been very lonely. In the spring of 1882, a situation arose in Dodge City that required a kind of attention that went beyond the ordinary business of ranching, and it touched on one of the harder truths of the frontier that Susanna had been aware of since arriving, and which George had spoken about with careful honesty. The situation involved a family, a woman named Agnes Whitehorse and her 2 children, who had been living on the edge of town in the particular precariousness of people who existed in the cracks between the structures of 1880s Kansas society. Agnes was part Cheyenne, widowed, with 2 boys aged 6 and 9, and the town had not been kind in the way that towns were often not kind to people who did not fit the acceptable categories. There had been an incident at the general store, an accusation of theft against the older boy, Tommy, that the storekeeper could not actually substantiate but had made loudly and publicly. And the result was that Agnes was struggling to find work, and the family was genuinely short of food. Maybelle Dodd had written to Susanna about it, because Maybelle Dodd wrote to Susanna about everything that mattered in Dodge, and Susanna had brought the letter to the kitchen table and left it there in a position that suggested she intended George to read it. He read it. He came to find her in the garden, where she was working on the kitchen beds with James on a blanket nearby, studying a grasshopper with intense concentration. "What do you think we should do?" he asked, sitting on the fence rail. "I think we could offer her work," she said, not looking up from the weeding. "If she wanted it. There is enough here for 2 women and more than enough space." "I was thinking the same," he said. She did look up then. "The town will have something to say about it." "The town will have something to say regardless," he said. "That is what towns do. What they say does not have to be what we do." They drove into Dodge the following Thursday, and Maybelle arranged an introduction. And Agnes Whitehorse, who was a quiet woman with the particular dignity of someone who has been treated unfairly and has chosen not to let it reduce her, listened to the offer with the careful attention of someone who had learned to assess offers thoroughly before trusting them. It would be real work, Susanna told her directly. Not charity. The pay would be $8 a month. You would have your own rooms in the East Wing. Your boys are welcome to be there. Agnes looked at her for a long moment with dark eyes that missed nothing. "You understand the position this puts you in Dodge City?" "I understand it," Susanna said. "I grew up in an orphanage in Philadelphia. I am familiar with how people feel about those who are categorized as outsiders." Agnes looked at her differently after that. Not differently in terms of trust. Trust was not built in a conversation, but differently in terms of recognition. She came to the ranch the following Monday with her boys and a single trunk, and the measured manner of someone arriving somewhere they are not yet certain of. Tommy, the 9-year-old, was suspicious in the way children are when they have been hurt enough to develop a healthy distrust of new circumstances. James, who was 6 months old and therefore incapable of suspicion, solved this particular problem by regarding Tommy with the uncomplicated fascination of a baby encountering a new person, which after approximately 2 days had Tommy making faces at him in the kitchen, with the slightly embarrassed expression of a 9-year-old who has been charmed by an infant and is not sure how to maintain his dignity about it. Agnes was good at her work with the particular efficiency of someone who has been managing on very little, which sharpens certain skills considerably. She and Susanna developed a working arrangement with the natural efficiency of 2 capable women who respect each other's competence, and over the months that followed, the working arrangement became something less formal. A friendship, careful and real, built in the way frontier friendships were built, out of the accumulated evidence of showing up and being honest. The year of 1882 moved through its seasons. The cattle drive north in the spring, the summer heat, the September harvest of the kitchen garden, the autumn preparations, and the Chandler Ranch accumulated the quality of a place with multiple lives in it, which Susanna found she loved in a way she had not anticipated. The house that had been a bachelor's efficient but lonely domain, and then hers and George's was now larger feeling for having the Whitehorse family in it. The boys running through the yard with the dogs and Tommy teaching James, as he grew, to identify tracks in the mud by the creek. George had words at the general store in Dodge City in October of 1882 regarding the storekeeper's continued habit of watching Tommy whenever the boy came into the establishment. The words were not dramatic or aggressive in the way that frontier altercations sometimes were. There were no raised voices and no hands near anyone's weapons, but they were absolutely clear, and the particular quality of George Chandler's clarity when he had made up his mind about something was understood by most people in Dodge City to be more final than a great deal of other men's loudness. The storekeeper changed his behavior toward Tommy. George did not mention this at home except once briefly when Agnes thanked him. "Tommy has a right to buy nails the same as anyone," he said. "There is nothing else to it." Agnes looked at him with the measuring directness she had. "There is a great deal more to it than you are taking credit for," she said. "Perhaps," he said, and went back to his coffee, and that was that. In the spring of 1883, Susanna realized she was expecting again, which she told George on a Tuesday morning with the comfortable directness of a woman who has been telling this man important things for 2 years, and has found him entirely trustworthy with them. He received it with the same quality he had received it the first time, first asking if she was well, then needing a moment, then being transparently happy about it. And she found that the repetition of the pattern was not less moving for being predictable, because predictability in the right person is not a lesser thing but a kind of assurance. She told Agnes over breakfast, and Agnes said, with the dry warmth that characterized her, "James is going to be insufferable about having a sibling," which was probably accurate. The baby came in November of 1883, a girl this time, born with a full head of dark hair, and an expression of serene certainty that George said reminded him of Susanna when she had decided something, which Susanna took as the compliment it was intended to be. They named her Clara, not after Clara Pettigrew and the dress, which had its own complicated history, but after Susanna's mother, whose name was written in the Bible that was among the first things Susanna had ever truly owned. James, who was 2 years old and had strong opinions about most things, regarded his sister for approximately 48 hours with the cautious evaluation of someone uncertain about a new development, and then appointed himself her primary protector and advocate with the irreversibility of a decision made by a very certain 2-year-old, and that was how it remained. The years between 1883 and 1886 built the life that Susanna had not known she was building toward, or rather had not allowed herself to imagine, because imagination of specific happiness had felt like a debt she would eventually have to repay. The ranch grew. George was canny about the land market and bought the neighboring property in 1884, doubling their acreage, and the herd expanded accordingly. Thomas Reed married a woman named Ruth who came from Missouri and who arrived in Dodge City with opinions about everything and a laugh like a bell. And Ruth and Susanna became friends immediately and without ceremony, the way people sometimes do when they recognize each other as the same kind of person. Agnes Whitehorse's older boy, Tommy, turned 16 in 1884 and began working with the ranch crew, where he proved himself fast and capable, and earned the unvarnished respect of men who respected nothing but performance, which George had expected because he had been watching the boy for 2 years and knew what he was. The younger boy, Daniel, showed an aptitude for numbers that led to him spending hours at the kitchen table with George's ledgers and Susanna's active encouragement, because Susanna had a gift for identifying what people were capable of and thought it should be applied. The Chandler Ranch became, over those years, the kind of place that people in the community thought of as a fixed point, the kind of place where things were done with integrity, and where, if you were in genuine need, you might find help that was offered as a matter of course rather than charity. George was known for paying his crew fairly and treating them with respect, which in 1880s cattle country was not universal. Susanna was known for running a household with extraordinary competence and for the particular quality of making people feel genuinely welcome, which was something she had learned in part by having been so consistently unwelcome, and which she was determined to provide in the other direction. In the spring of 1885, she came back from a Sunday morning at the church to find Mrs. Bellamy's wagon in the yard. Mrs. Bellamy, who had moved her shop to a larger premises on Main Street in 1883, and who now employed 2 assistants and a milliner, did not typically make house calls, so Susanna climbed down from the buggy with the slightly alert quality of someone who has learned that unexpected visits usually mean something. Mrs. Bellamy was sitting at the kitchen table with George and a cup of coffee, and she looked up when Susanna came in with the expression of someone who has been waiting and is pleased the waiting is done. "I have something I want to propose to you," Mrs. Bellamy said, without preamble, which was her style. "I have more business than I can manage and I need a partner. Someone who understands household management and organization and has a good eye. I have been watching you for 4 years, Mrs. Chandler." Susanna sat down at the table. "I have no training as a dressmaker," she said. "You do not need to be a dressmaker," Mrs. Bellamy said. "I have dressmakers. I need someone to run the business end, the accounts, the ordering, the appointments, the management of the shop. It would be 3 days a week in town. I suspect you could do it without breaking a sweat." Susanna looked at George, who was drinking his coffee with the expression of a man who knows something and is waiting to see if the knowledge is needed. "You knew about this?" she asked. "She wrote to me first to ask if I would object," he said. "I told her she should ask you because it was your decision, but that I would not object to anything you wanted to do." She looked back at Mrs. Bellamy. She thought about the bolt shop with the teal-green broadcloth and the moment she had pointed at things that had become hers. She thought about what it was to have a skill you had been refining for years, the organizational capability, the attention to what people needed, the gift for logistics, and to apply it to something that was public and professional. "All right," she said. "Yes." Mrs. Bellamy's expression was satisfied. "Good, I thought you would." 3 days a week in Dodge City, managing the business operations of Bellamy's dry goods and dressmaking, which expanded under Susanna's management of the accounts and ordering into one of the better-run establishments in Dodge City, changed something in her life in a way that she found unexpectedly important. She had always been competent in service of other people's households. Being competent in service of something that was partially her own professional domain was different, and the difference was the difference between lending your hands and using them. George drove her in on those 3 days and sometimes met her for lunch at the hotel, which had remained their particular place from the first Saturday they had been in Dodge City together, and which had the quality of a tradition with enough history in it to mean something. James, who was growing fast and showed signs of his father's manner, the same steady quality, the same listening eyes, came sometimes and sat on the steps of Bellamy's shop doing his letters, or watching the street with the focused attention of a child who is taking everything in. Clara, who was 2 and then 3 and then 4, was Susanna's daughter in the most specific way that children can be like a parent. She had Susanna's directness and her organizational instinct and her habit of straightening things that were crooked, and also Susanna's capacity for deep feeling that she held carefully, not suppressed but managed, until something earned its way past the management and then felt completely. In the autumn of 1886, 6 years after Susanna had arrived at the Chandler ranch with 3 borrowed dresses and a carpet bag, she stood in the bedroom on a Saturday morning and looked at her wardrobe, which had grown carefully, not extravagantly, because she was constitutionally unable to acquire things without purpose, into a collection of things that were entirely hers. The teal-green dress was still there, a little worn at the cuffs now, but still good, still the most particular thing she owned. 3 working dresses made by Mrs. Bellamy to fit her precisely. The silk, which she had worn to Ruth and Thomas's wedding, and to every significant occasion because the silk was not just beautiful, but because the silk represented the moment George had said everything she pointed at, which was the moment she had understood that being known and cared for in the specific way, not generally or performatively but specifically, was possible and real. A winter coat in dark gray wool that she had chosen herself from a catalog, and which was hers from the moment of the choosing. 2 pairs of leather shoes, her own size, one practical and one good. She stood and looked at the wardrobe and felt the particular quality of being situated in a life, deeply and irreversibly situated, with roots that went down through the wooden floor of the ranch house and into the Kansas earth, and were not going anywhere. George came in from the early morning check of the livestock, which he did every day still regardless of season, and found her standing looking at the wardrobe and came to stand beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Clara Pettigrew's dress," she said. He looked at the wardrobe. "Tell me." She told him then the whole history of it, the 3 women, the orphanage, the way she had arrived in Dodge City with things that had belonged to everyone else and nothing that had been chosen for her. She had told him pieces over the years, but not the whole narrative, not the continuous thread of it from the beginning to the moment in Mrs. Bellamy's shop, when she had pointed at the teal-green broadcloth, and it had become hers. He listened the way he always listened, with the full and complete attention that was one of the things she had fallen in love with first. She could pinpoint it now, knew it had been the Tuesday morning in the hotel hallway when he had said, "You are the one who ironed the curtains," because that was the first time she had been seen clearly, and it had frightened her and interested her in equal measure. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The morning light was coming through the east-facing window that she had chosen for their bedroom, because she loved mornings and the light that came in from the east. "I am glad you wore Clara Pettigrew's dress to church that October," he said, "because you were there to wear it, and that is what mattered. But I am gladder still that you have not needed to borrow anything since." "The silk was extravagant," she said. "The silk was essential," he said firmly, and it was the argument from breakfast 5 years ago completed, and she laughed, and he laughed with her, and James appeared in the doorway wanting to know why they were laughing, and if there was going to be breakfast any time soon. That evening, after the children were in bed, James asleep with the compact certainty of a 5-year-old who has run himself to the edge of the day, Clara less certainly asleep but quiet, which was sufficient, and the ranch was settling into its night sounds. Susanna and George sat on the porch in the October dark, the way they had been sitting on the porch in October dark since the first year. With their coffee and the enormous Kansas sky above them, full of stars, the way the sky is full of stars, only in places where there is no other light to compete with it. Agnes came out briefly to say she was taking her lamp to the east wing and that Tommy had sent a letter. He had gone up to Abilene with a cattle crew that spring and was doing well, sending money home. She went inside and the quiet settled again. "I want to tell you something," Susanna said. George looked at her. The porch lamp was behind them and the star glow was in front, and his face had the quality she had always loved best, open and present and specifically hers. "I spent 23 years waiting for my life to start," she said. "Not dramatically, not in despair. Just in the way that people do when they are always in someone else's space, wearing someone else's things, living in the margins of other people's stories. I did not know I was waiting. I thought that was simply what there was." She paused. The night was cold and clear, and the coyotes were out on the flat dark somewhere, their sound as much a part of the prairie's voice as the wind. "I know now that I was waiting," she said, "and I know that you are what I was waiting for. Not because you rescued me, I do not need that and you would not have offered it that way, but because you saw me. From the beginning, from the hotel hallway with the curtains, you saw me as a person who was there." George set down his coffee cup and reached across and covered her hand with his, the same gesture he had made on the morning she had told him about the baby, the same gesture she had come to understand was his version of saying everything he could not make words do justice to. "I saw you," he said. "I have been seeing you since October 1880 and I have not stopped." She turned her hand in his so their fingers were intertwined. "I know," she said. "That is what I wanted to tell you." They sat together in the October dark with the stars overhead and the prairie around them, and the house behind them, full of their sleeping children and the lives they had built together. And the silence between them had the quality of everything it had always had, warmth and solidity, and the particular ease of two people who have learned each other completely, and found the complete version better than the partial one. The years after that were the accumulation of a life that was genuinely full, and the fullness was not without the ordinary difficulties of frontier existence, the hard winters, the uncertain cattle markets, the anxieties that come with children growing up in a world that is not always kind, the losses that come with time, and the prairie's own particular indifference to human attachment. George's horse, the one he had ridden from Texas and had been with him through the building of everything, died in the winter of 1887, and he did not speak much for 2 days, and Susanna let the silence be and brought him coffee and sat near him in the evenings, which was the right thing, which she knew because she knew him. Agnes's younger son, Daniel, showed himself to be gifted enough with numbers that George funded his education at a school in Kansas City in 1887, which was a thing that mattered beyond the individual, and that they all knew it. Tommy came back from Abilene in the spring of 1888 with a young woman named Ellen, the daughter of a mixed-race family that ran a farm north of the city. And Agnes received this information with the composed happiness of a woman who has been hoping for something, and is grateful but not surprised. Mrs. Bellamy, who had no family of her own, began to spend holidays at the ranch in a way that gradually formalized into a standing arrangement. And she and Susanna sat over the account books together and argued about stock ordering with the comfortable directness of women who respect each other's intelligence and do not need to soften things. In 1889, Susanna and George's third child arrived, another boy, named William after nobody in particular except that it was a name that felt like its own thing, and they had always liked it. James, who was 8, received his brother with the serious intentionality of a boy who understood responsibilities. Clara, who was 5 and had definite views, announced that she expected him to be interesting as soon as possible, which William, being a baby, deferred on. William arrived in a Kansas that was different in specific ways from the Kansas of 1880, because the frontier was changing in the way that frontiers change, slowly, and then all at once, with the railroad's expansion and the farming settlements and the gradual replacement of open range with fenced land, the cattle drives of the Kishom Trail becoming a thing of the past as the shipping routes changed. George managed the transition with the same steady practicality he brought to everything, diversifying the operation, shifting from pure cattle driving to a mixed ranching and farming model that suited the changing land and the changing economics. He talked to Susanna about all of it, which was not universal among men of the era and which she had long since stopped being surprised by. They sat at the kitchen table in the evenings after the children were in bed and talked through the business decisions, the way they talked through everything, with directness and honesty and the particular confidence of two people who trust each other completely. "The long drives are ending," he said one evening in 1889, with the equanimity of a man who knows what he is going to do about a thing even when he is sad about its passing. "The rail lines have changed it. We will need to think differently." "The south pasture could carry wheat if it were broken properly," she said, and Ruth mentioned that the Reeds are considering adding a small dairy operation. "We might share the cost of equipment." He looked at her across the table with the expression she knew well, the one that was both affectionate and impressed in the particular way of a man who is very glad he married the person he married. "You have been thinking about this," he said. "I think about most things," she said. "I know," he said. "It is one of the things I rely on." She reached across the table and put her hand over his in the gesture that was now as natural as breathing, the gesture that meant "I am here, and I know you, and none of this is borrowed." "We will be all right," she said. "We have built enough for the land to carry us through changes." "We have," he said, and he meant the land and the cattle and the diversification possibilities, but he also meant everything else: the house, the children, the years of evenings on the porch and breakfasts at the kitchen table, and the accumulated solid weight of a life built carefully and well. The autumn of 1890, Susanna Chandler, which was still her name in its new form, no less strange for a decade of use, still possessing the quality of something she had chosen rather than been assigned, stood in Mrs. Bellamy's shop on Main Street in Dodge City, doing the quarterly accounts with the practiced efficiency of 10 years of keeping the business running, and looked up when the bell above the door rang. A young woman came in. She was perhaps 20, maybe 21, wearing a dress that was serviceable and clean but which sat slightly wrong on her, too short in the bodice and wide in the shoulders, the recognizable fit of something passed down. She had the quality of someone who is accustomed to making themselves small, keeping to edges, not taking up more space than the minimum required. She moved with the careful consciousness of someone aware that they do not entirely belong in any room they enter. Susanna set down her pen. She recognized the quality. She had been that woman. She had stood in doorways with borrowed clothes and the practiced chin-up that she had learned in the Philadelphia orphanage and deployed for 23 years. "Good afternoon," she said, and she said it the way she had learned from George, seeing the person, not through them or past them but at them, registering that they were there. The young woman looked up, slightly surprised at the directness of it. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I was looking for work. I was told Mrs. Bellamy might need someone." Mrs. Bellamy came in from the back room at the sound of the bell, assessed the situation in 2 seconds with her sharp eyes, and looked at Susanna. Susanna looked back at her. They had a decade of communication that did not require much speech. Mrs. Bellamy's expression said, "Your call." Susanna's expression said, "Yes." "Sit down," Susanna said to the young woman and pulled out the chair across from her desk. "Tell me your name and what you can do. We will figure out the rest." The young woman's name was Catherine, and she had come from Ohio, and she was, as it turned out, very capable and not used to being told so. And she sat at the edge of the offered chair the way Susanna had sat at the edge of chairs for years, and answered every question with the careful precision of someone who has learned that everything they offer might be found insufficient. When Catherine left an hour later with the offer of a trial position starting Monday, Susanna sat at the desk for a moment and thought about October 1880, and a woman in a hotel hallway with a carpet bag and 3 borrowed dresses, and the man who had said, "You are the one who ironed the curtains," and meant it. She wrote a note to George. She had become a reliable letter writer over the years, a habit that had started when he was away on the drives and continued because she liked the form of it, the way writing pinned things to being real. And she told him about Catherine, and she told him the other thing, which was something she had been sitting with for a few days and was now certain of. She was expecting again. The 4th. She folded the note and sent it with the ranch hand who had come for the accounts, and she went back to the order books, and she thought about the house, her house, their house, the house with the east-facing window and the kitchen where the pot rack was properly attached to the ceiling beam, and the pantry organized exactly as she had determined it should be, and how full it was going to be, and how completely and entirely hers. George came himself rather than sending a reply. He appeared at the shop door at 4 in the afternoon, having ridden in from the ranch rather than waiting for the morning, and Mrs. Bellamy looked up and made the expression of someone who has decided to find an errand in the back room very suddenly. He came to the desk, and Susanna looked up at him from the account books. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am very well," she said. He put his hands on the edge of the desk and leaned forward and kissed her right there in the front room of Bellamy's Dry Goods, which was not typical frontier behavior and which she was not remotely sorry about. "The 4th," he said. "The 4th," she confirmed. "Well," he said, and sat down in the chair across the desk, the one she had pulled out for Catherine 2 hours ago. "I suppose we will need to think about the east bedroom." "I have been thinking about it," she said. "The east bedroom and possibly an addition to the north side. Thomas and Ruth's new house has that design that runs." "Susanna," he said. She stopped. He was looking at her with the expression that she had last seen in December 1880 in the church, the full and unreserved version, nothing withheld. "I love you," he said simply, because it was the thing to say and he meant it and nothing else was needed. She felt the thing in her chest that had been sealed for the first 23 years of her life, and open for the last 10, wide open now, fully and permanently open, the way things open when they have had enough time and warmth and consistent care to trust that opening is safe. "I love you, George Chandler," she said, and it had the weight and the solidity of everything it had accumulated over a decade of mornings and evenings and October drives, and the needle case with the bird handles, and the teal-green dress, and everything she had pointed at that had become hers. The 4th child was born in the summer of 1891, a boy named Henry, who arrived in July when the Kansas heat was at its most unapologetic, and who was, from the first hour, the most amiable of the Chandler children, inclined toward laughter and the company of anyone who would provide it. James, who was 9, and had the particular pride of an older brother who has been waiting to see what the next edition would be, declared Henry acceptable. Clara, who was 7, and had not changed her position about expecting interesting people to arrive in her vicinity, said he would have to grow into interesting, but she could see the potential. William, who was 2 and magnificently self-contained, looked at Henry with the measured assessment of someone reserving judgment, and went back to the serious business of stacking things. Agnes's son Daniel came back from Kansas City in the autumn of 1891, with credentials in accounting and the manner of a young man who has learned things, and is grateful and serious about using them. George offered him the full management of the ranch accounts, which was both the obvious and the generous thing, and Daniel accepted it with the quiet dignity that Agnes had given him, and which was entirely his own. The Chandler Ranch in 1891 was a different place from the bachelor's efficient operation that Susanna had arrived at in August 1880. It was larger in acreage and in cattle. It had the addition to the north side of the house that they had built in 1890, and the kitchen garden that Susanna had rescued from wildness in that first summer was now a real kitchen garden of considerable productivity, which Agnes managed with expertise that far exceeded Susanna's, and which Susanna was entirely happy to acknowledge. The house had people in it, real, various, permanent people, not a household running in service of one person, but a community of people living alongside each other with the kind of care that is built over years and does not require articulation. In November of 1891, the small church 3 miles from the ranch held a Sunday service at which Reverend James, who had married George and Susanna 11 years prior, and who was now older and had a permanent lean to the left from decades of prairie wind, gave a sermon on the specific and transformative power of being genuinely seen by another person, which was either a coincidence or something Mrs. Bellamy had suggested to him, and which Susanna sat through in the third pew with George beside her and Henry on her lap, and Clara pushing her boot into James's boot in a sibling dispute, and William asleep on George's shoulder, and thought about in the way she thought about things that mattered carefully and completely, and with the full weight of knowing what they meant. Afterward, on the drive home in the larger wagon that their family now required George at the reins, the children arranged in the back with the organized chaos of 4 children aged between 4 months and 9 years. She looked at the prairie in November, which was brown and gold and enormous, and thought about all the places she had been, and all the borrowed things, and all the careful smallness of a life lived in other people's margins. She thought about Tuesday morning in a hotel hallway with linens and a man who had looked at her, and said, "You are the one who ironed the curtains." She thought about October on a prairie road and the question asked with the steadiness of a man who had made up his mind. She thought about Mrs. Bellamy's shop and the teal-green broadcloth and the silk and the shoes that fit her actual feet and the man who had said everything she pointed at. She thought about everything that had been hers, genuinely and specifically hers, since that day, the house, the kitchen, the ledgers at Bellamy's, the children in the wagon behind her, the man beside her on the seat with his hands easy on the reins and his shoulder warm against hers. She reached across and put her hand on George's arm, and he covered it with his own without looking away from the road, which was the gesture it always was, which was the gesture that meant everything it had always meant. The prairie was wide and the sky was high and the ranch was waiting 12 miles ahead, and Susanna Chandler, who had worn borrowed clothes her whole life until the day a man had taken her to the dressmaker, and said everything she pointed at sat in the November morning and felt the full and specific weight of a life that was entirely, irreversibly, and permanently her own. The wagon rolled through the dry grass. The children's voices rose and fell behind them. The sky was cloudless above the endless Kansas plain, and the ranch came into view around the long, slow bend in the road. The house with its east-facing window, the kitchen garden, the bunkhouse and the barn and the corral, and the whole accumulated evidence of something built with care and intention over more than a decade. And it was exactly what it had always been. Every morning she had seen it from the moment she stepped down from Eli's wagon in August 1880. It was hers. It was home. It was both, and always had been the same thing. And Susanna Hawthorne Chandler, who had been looking for a home since she was 7 years old, looked at it coming toward her through the November light, and knew, with the absolute and settled certainty of a woman who has been searching for something and has found it and lived in it long enough to know it will not be taken, that she had arrived, and that she was staying, and that this, finally and completely, was where she had always been going.